The wind howling through Blackwood Valley carried rumors sharper than knives, and they all pointed toward one man, Silas Thorne. To the townsfolk, he wasn't human. He was a scar-faced demon who lived above the snow line, a savage who had abandoned civilization for blood and silence. But in a town ruled by greed, the real monsters often wore silk suits and polite smiles. When Sarah Miller was forced to choose between the town's richest tyrant and the beast on the mountain, she chose the beast. Everyone expected a massacre. No one expected a love story that would burn the town's secrets to the ground. The wooden floorboards of the Blackwood General Store creaked under the weight of nervous silence. It was noon, yet the air inside felt cold, heavy with the dust of the frontier and the stench of unwashed bodies. Men who usually boasted loud enough to shake the rafters stood with their heads bowed, eyes darting toward the massive figure looming near the counter. Silas Thorne was not a man easily ignored. Standing 6'5", clad in bare furs that still smelled of the wild, he looked like a piece of the mountain had broken off and walked into town. A thick, jagged scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, pulling his lip into a permanent, gruesome snarl. His beard was a tangled thicket of black and grey, and his eyes, the color of chipped flint, dared anyone to speak. He slammed a sack of pelts onto the counter. The sound cracked like a whip. Old man Higgins, the storekeep, trembled as he tallied the value. $40, Mr. Thorne. Best I can do. The market is soft. Silas didn't speak. He simply stared. It was a stare that stripped a man of his courage. He pointed a gloved finger at the supplies behind the counter. Salt, ammunition, flour, and a small, delicate bag of sugar. From the back of the store, Sarah Miller watched him, her breath caught in her throat. She was 22, with hair the color of dried wheat and hands roughened by years of scrubbing floors that weren't hers. She held a broom like a shield, trying to make herself invisible. She had heard the stories. They said Silas Thorne had killed 3 men with his bare hands in a saloon brawl 10 years ago. They said he spoke to wolves. They said he had no heart, only a cold stone where it should be. But as Sarah watched, she saw something the others missed. When Higgins placed the bag of sugar on the counter, the sack tore slightly on a nail. A trickle of white crystals spilled out. Silas didn't rage. He didn't slam his fist. He reached out, his massive hand hovering over the spill, and for a split second, his flinty eyes softened with something that looked painfully like regret. He carefully scooped the spilled sugar back into the tear and held it closed with a gentleness that contradicted his terrifying appearance. "Well, look at this," a oily voice sneered from the doorway. The atmosphere in the room shifted from fearful to suffocating. Barnaby Finch had arrived. Finch was the mayor, the banker, and the owner of nearly every building in Blackwood Valley. He wore a suit that cost more than Sarah would earn in 10 lifetimes, and his smile was a greased trap. He stepped into the store, flanked by 2 of his hired guns, Cobb and Miller. "The beast descends," Finch mocked, stepping closer to Silas. Silas didn't turn, but his shoulders tensed. "Did you run out of squirrels to eat, Thorne? Or did you come to scare the children?" Silas ignored him, gathering his supplies. Finch, accustomed to fear and obedience, didn't like being ignored. He turned his gaze to the back of the room, spotting Sarah. His eyes narrowed, gleaming with a predatory hunger that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Sarah, my dear," Finch called out, his voice dripping with false sweetness. "Stop hiding in the dust. Come here." Sarah hesitated, gripping the broom tighter. "I have work, Mr. Finch." "Your work is whatever I say it is," Finch snapped, his facade slipping. "Your father's debt is 3 months overdue. I've been patient, but patience costs interest." Sarah stepped forward, her chin trembling but held high. I paid you last week. Every cent I made washing for the miners. Interest, Sarah. Compound interest. It's a tricky thing for a simple girl. Finch laughed, stepping closer and reaching out to touch a lock of her hair. Sarah flinched away. Silas Thorne stopped packing his bag. The room went dead silent. "Don't," Silas grunted. His voice was like grinding gravel, unused and rusty. Finch froze, his hand mid-air. He turned slowly to the mountain man. "Excuse me? Did the animal speak?" Silas turned. Up close, the scar was terrifying, a roadmap of violence. But he didn't look at Finch. He looked at Sarah. He looked at the fear in her eyes, the way she shrank away from the mayor's touch. "She said no," Silas rumbled. Finch chuckled, though it sounded nervous. "This is town business, Thorne. Go back to your cave. This girl owes me $500. Unless she can pay it, or find a husband to pay it for her, she belongs to the bank, which means she belongs to me." Finch grabbed Sarah's wrist, pulling her roughly toward him. "And I think she's finally ready to work off her debt in my private quarters." "No!" Sarah cried, struggling, but Finch was surprisingly strong, and his guards stepped forward, hands on their holsters. Thud. A heavy bag of gold dust landed on the counter between them. Everyone stared at the pouch. It was Silas's. "500, Silas said. Finch stared at the gold, then at Silas. Greed warred with pride in his watery eyes. "You're paying her debt? Why? You don't even know her." "Buying her contract," Silas corrected. He looked at Sarah, his expression unreadable. "She comes with me." The room gasped. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Go with Silas Thorne, the man who was rumored to skin men alive? Finch laughed, a cruel barking sound. "Oh, this is rich. You want to buy her? Fine, but the price just went up. 600 for the inconvenience." Silas didn't blink. He reached into his coat and slapped a second, smaller pouch down. Finch's grin faded. He looked at Sarah, then at the gold. He released her wrist with a shove. "Sold," he spat. "Take her. She's probably better suited for a cave anyway." Sarah stumbled, catching herself against the counter. She looked at Silas, terror seizing her chest. She had been saved from Finch, but at what cost? Had she just been sold from one monster to another? Silas didn't smile. He didn't offer a hand. He simply picked up his supplies, slung his rifle over his shoulder, and looked at her. "Let's go," he said. The climb was grueling. For 3 hours they trudged through knee-deep snow, leaving the soot-stained slush of Blackwood behind for the pristine, biting cold of the high peaks. Sarah wore only a thin wool coat and worn leather boots that leaked freezing water. Her teeth chattered so violently, her jaw ached. Silas walked 10 paces ahead, forging a path. He didn't look back. He seemed impervious to the cold, a creature woven from the winter itself. "He's going to kill me," Sarah thought, her mind racing with the town's rumors. "He bought me to cook his meals until he tires of me, and then he'll toss me off a cliff." As the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, casting long, purple shadows across the snow, Sarah stumbled. Her foot caught on a buried root, and she fell hard, gasping as the icy air burned her lungs. She lay there for a moment, too exhausted to rise. She heard the heavy crunch of boots returning. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the blow, waiting for him to yell at her to get up. Instead, the wind stopped. She opened her eyes. Silas was kneeling beside her, blocking the gale with his massive body. He wasn't glaring. He was frowning, looking at her shivering form with concern. Without a word, he unclasped the heavy bear fur cloak from his shoulders. The heat radiating from it hit her face instantly. He draped it over her. It was heavy, smelling of pine resin and wood smoke, and it was the warmest thing she had ever felt. "Up," he said. Not a command, but a necessity. Almost there. He didn't walk ahead this time. He slowed his pace, matching her exhausted trudge. When the terrain got too steep, he didn't drag her. He offered his arm. It was as hard as iron, but his grip was careful, ensuring he didn't bruise her. They reached the cabin just as night fell. It wasn't the dark, dank cave Sarah had imagined. It was a sturdy structure built of massive logs, nestled against a sheltering rock face. Smoke curled invitingly from a stone chimney. Silas pushed the door open. "Inside." Sarah stepped in and stopped, stunned. The interior was warm, lit by the golden glow of a roaring hearth. But it was the details that shocked her. The cabin was clean, meticulously clean. The floor was swept. Shelves lined the walls, filled not just with jars of preserved food, but with books. Dozens of them. Leather-bound classics, journals, scientific texts. And in the corner, near the only window, stood a partially carved block of wood. It looked like a bird taking flight, the details so delicate they seemed impossible for hands as large as Silas's. Silas walked past her, reclaiming the space. He hung his rifle on the wall and pointed to a rocking chair near the fire. "Sit. Warm up." He moved to the small kitchen area. Sarah watched him, confused. This wasn't the lair of a beast. This was the home of a man who valued order and beauty. "Why?" she whispered, the question escaping before she could stop it. Silas paused, a cast-iron skillet in his hand. He didn't turn around. "Why what?" "Why did you pay? That was a fortune. You don't know me." Silas set the skillet on the stove. He stayed silent for a long time, the crackling fire the only sound. "Barnaby Finch breaks things," Silas said finally, his voice low. "He breaks horses. He breaks land. He breaks people. I didn't want to watch him break you." Sarah stared at his back. "So what now? Am I your servant? Your wife?" Silas turned then. The firelight danced across his scars, making them look deeper, more jagged, but his eyes were weary. "You are a guest, Sarah Miller, until the snow clears in the spring. Then, if you want to leave, I'll give you the mule and enough gold to get to the city. You owe me nothing." Sarah felt a shockwave go through her. "Spring? That's 3 months away." "The pass is blocked now. No way down without risking death," Silas grunted. He began slicing cured meat. "There's a spare room in the back. It has a lock on the inside. You use it. I won't disturb you." He was giving her a lock? A barrier against him? "I don't understand," she stammered. "Everyone says you. I know what they say." Silas cut her off, his tone hardening. "They say I'm a monster. They say I killed my unit in the war. They say I eat children." He looked at her, his expression intense. "Believe what you want, but eat your stew before it gets cold." That night, Sarah lay in the small back room, buried under 3 quilts. The door was locked, just as he said. She stared at the rough timber ceiling. She had expected horror. Instead, she had found books, warmth, and a man who spent a fortune to save her simply because he didn't like seeing things broken. But as she drifted off, she heard Silas in the main room. He was pacing, and then a low, agonized sound, like a man waking from a nightmare, echoed through the thin walls. "I'm sorry. I couldn't save them. I'm sorry." Sarah sat up in the darkness. The monster wasn't sleeping. The monster was crying. The first week at the cabin passed in a blur of awkward silence and startling discoveries. Sarah expected the days to be filled with the brutal, bloody work of survival, skinning beasts, chopping wood until her hands bled, dodging the rages of a madman. Instead, she found herself in a rhythm that was strangely peaceful. Silas was a ghost in his own home. He rose before the sun, usually disappearing into the tree line to check traps or haul water, and returned only when the light turned grey. He ate the meals she cooked, simple stews made from the dried venison and root vegetables stored in the cellar, with a quiet nod of thanks, but he offered no conversation. He never touched her. He never raised his voice. He treated her like a frightened deer that might bolt if he moved too fast. It was on the 7th day that the curiosity gnawing at Sarah finally won out. Silas had left early, taking his sled but leaving his rifle, which was unusual. Sarah finished sweeping the already spotless floor and decided to follow the faint, peculiar smell she had noticed since arriving, a scent of damp earth and blooming green that had no business existing in the dead of winter. She followed the scent to the back of the cabin, where a heavy wooden door sat partially obscured by a stack of firewood. She had assumed it was a woodshed. She pushed it open and gasped. It wasn't a shed, it was a glass house. Built against the southern rock face to catch the heat, the structure was a marvel of engineering. Thick glass panes, likely hauled up the mountain at great cost, created a sanctuary against the snow. Inside, the air was humid and warm. Rows of wooden planters overflowed with life, medicinal herbs, hearty root vegetables, and in the far corner, a single, vibrant bush of red roses struggling against the chill. But it wasn't the plants that stopped Sarah's heart. It was Silas. He was kneeling in the dirt, his massive frame hunched over a small work table. He wasn't carving. He was bandaging. A small red fox lay on the table, its leg mangled, likely by a trap. Silas's large, scarred hands the town said had strangled men, were moving with the precision of a surgeon. He was whispering to the animal, a low, melodic hum that seemed to calm the creature's trembling. Sarah stepped on a loose floorboard. Creak. Silas spun around, his body instantly shifting into a defensive crouch. When he saw it was her, the tension didn't leave his shoulders, but his eyes lost their lethal edge. He looked embarrassed. "I didn't mean to pry," Sarah stammered, stepping back. "I just roses. Up here?" Silas stood, wiping his bloody hands on a rag. He looked at the fox, then at the roses. "They were my mother's favorite. The roots are deep. They survive the frost if you tend them." Sarah walked closer, her fear replaced by a confusing warmth. "You're healing it." "It was caught in one of Finch's traps," Silas muttered, his voice darkening. "He sets them on the property line. Illegal ones. Steel teeth that shatter bone." He gently stroked the fox's ears. "I can set the bone, but he won't hunt again. He'll have to stay here." Sarah looked around the greenhouse. There were other cages, all open. A one-winged hawk perched on a rafter. A rabbit with a missing ear chewed on a carrot. This wasn't a hunter's lodge. It was an infirmary. "They say you're a monster," Sarah said softly. "In town. They say you kill for sport." Silas turned his back to her, returning to the fox. "It's easier that way." "Easier?" "If they fear me, they leave me alone. If they think I'm a savage, they don't come up here looking for—" He trailed off. "Looking for what?" Sarah pressed. Silas sighed, a heavy sound that seemed to rattle in his chest. "Redemption, Sarah. They don't come looking for the man they broke." He finished with the fox and walked past her, stopping at the door. "Don't tell anyone about this place. The reputation is the only wall I have left." That evening, the dynamic shifted. Sarah didn't retreat to her room immediately after dinner. She sat by the fire, mending a tear in one of Silas's shirts. Silas sat in his chair, reading a book on hydrology. "Barnaby Finch," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "He said you were in the war." Silas didn't look up from his book. I was? My father was too. He never came back. He died at Shiloh. Silas closed the book slowly. He looked at the fire, the flames reflecting in his dark eyes. I was at Shiloh. It was a bad place to die. Is that where you got the scar? Silas touched the jagged line on his face, unconsciously. No. I got this when I came home, when I tried to stop a man from taking what wasn't his. Finch? Silas looked at her then. Finch wasn't always the mayor. Before the war, he was a quartermaster. He managed supplies. While men were starving in the trenches, Finch was selling our boots and blankets to the highest bidder. I found out, I reported him. And the records disappeared. Finch had powerful friends. I came home a hero, and he came home a rich man. He bought the valley. He squeezed the farmers. When I confronted him publicly, 5 of his hired hands jumped me in the alley behind the saloon. They held me down while Finch carved my face with a broken bottle. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The cruelty was unimaginable. He did that to you? He wanted to make me a monster, Silas said, his voice void of emotion. So I became one. I took my family's land up here, the land he couldn't buy because the deed is ironclad, and I waited. I watched him rot the town from the inside out. Why didn't you leave? Because this mountain is the water source for the whole valley, Silas said, gesturing to the window. The creek that runs through town starts here. As long as I hold this land, Finch can't build his factories. He can't poison the water to mine the gold deeper in the hills. I am the cork in the bottle, Sarah. And he hates me for it. Sarah looked at the man she had feared. He wasn't a beast. He was a guardian. He was the only thing standing between Blackwood Valley and total destruction. He won't stop, will he? Sarah asked quietly. No. Silas stood up, his shadow stretching long across the floor. And now that I've taken you, his prize, he's going to come for us. The snow won't hold him back forever. 3 weeks later, the isolation was shattered not by nature, but by lead. Sarah was outside, helping Silas chop wood. The physical labor was grueling, but she found a strange satisfaction in it. She was stronger now. The mountain air had put color in her cheeks, and the constant fear knotting her stomach had unraveled. She and Silas had fallen into a partnership. It wasn't romance. Not yet. But it was a profound, silent reliance. He protected her. She anchored him. The crack of the rifle echoed off the canyon walls a split second before the wood next to Sarah's head exploded into splinters. Down! Silas roared. He didn't hesitate. He tackled Sarah into the snow, rolling them behind the massive stack of logs, just as a second bullet whizzed through the space where they had been standing. Stay down, Silas hissed. He didn't look panicked. He looked like a soldier. He crawled to the corner of the woodpile, pulling a revolver from his waistband. He didn't fire. He watched. Thorn! A voice echoed from the tree line. Come on out. We just want to talk. It was Cobb, Finch's head enforcer, a man with dead eyes and a smile missing 3 teeth. You're trespassing, Cobb, Silas shouted back, his voice booming. Step onto the clearing and I'll bury you where you stand. Laughter drifted from the trees. We got a warrant, Silas. Mayor says you kidnapped the girl. Says you're holding her against her will. We're here to rescue her. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Kidnapped, she whispered. He sold me to you. He rewrites history to suit him, Silas muttered. He looked at her, his eyes intense. Can you shoot? My father taught me a little, but I've never shot at a person. Silas pulled a smaller pistol from his boot and pressed it into her hand. It was warm from his skin. Don't shoot to kill unless they breach the perimeter. Shoot at the trees. Keep their heads down. I'm going to flank them." "You're leaving me." Terror spiked in her chest. "I'm ending this," Silas said. He squeezed her shoulder, a brief electric touch, and then he was gone, slipping into the deep snow on the far side of the woodpile, moving as silently as the wolves he was rumored to command. Sarah gripped the gun. "Rescue me." It was a lie. Finch didn't want to rescue her. He wanted to punish Silas. He wanted to take back his property and burn the mountain man's sanctuary to the ground. A figure darted from the trees. Miller, the other guard. He was running toward the cabin, a torch in his hand. "Burn him out!" Cobb yelled from cover. Sarah didn't think. She raised the heavy pistol, leveled it at the snow 3 feet in front of Miller, and pulled the trigger. The recoil jarred her arm to the shoulder. The bullet kicked up a spray of ice, causing Miller to stumble and drop the torch. "The girl's shooting!" Miller screamed, diving behind a rock. "Keep her busy!" Cobb yelled. Bullets chipped away at the log pile. Sarah huddled low, dust and bark raining down on her. She fired again blindly, just to make noise. "Where is Silas? Where is he?" Then a scream tore through the valley. It wasn't Sarah. It was Cobb. The shooting stopped instantly. "Cobb!" Miller yelled, his voice shaking. Silence. Then the sound of heavy footsteps crunching in the snow. Silas walked out of the tree line. He wasn't holding a gun. He was dragging Cobb by the collar of his coat. The enforcer was unconscious, his face bloody, his rifle bent in half as if it had been struck against a tree. Silas threw Cobb's limp body into the center of the clearing like a sack of garbage. He looked at the rock where Miller was hiding. "Go," Silas said. The word was quiet, but it carried more violence than the gunfire. Miller scrambled out from behind the rock, his hands raised. "I was just following orders, Thorne. Finch said—" "Tell Finch," Silas interrupted, stepping forward, the sunlight catching the scar on his face, making him look truly demonic, "that if he sends men to my home again, I won't send them back. Tell him the next thing I bring to town will be his own head." Miller nodded frantically, grabbed his unconscious partner by the arm, and began the arduous drag back down the trail. Silas watched them go until they disappeared around the bend. Only then did his shoulders slump. He turned to the woodpile. "Sarah." She stood up, her legs shaking so hard she could barely hold her weight. The gun slipped from her fingers into the snow. Silas rushed to her, checking her for wounds. "Did they hit you? Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she breathed, looking at him. He was terrifying. He was magnificent. "You didn't kill him?" "I don't kill unless I have to," Silas said, his breathing heavy. "But I broke his arm and 3 ribs. He won't hold a gun for a long time." He looked down at her, and the adrenaline seemed to drain out of him, leaving him vulnerable. "I'm sorry. I brought this to your door. I thought the gold would satisfy him." "It's not the gold," Sarah said, realizing the truth. "It's you. You're the only thing he can't control." Silas looked away, toward the valley below. "You're not safe here, Sarah." Today was a warning. Next time he'll bring a posse. He'll deputize men. He'll come with the law behind him. "So what do we do?" Sarah asked. She realized she had said we. Silas turned back to her. The distance between them felt non-existent now. They had fought together. "I have to send you away," Silas said, his voice cracking slightly. "Tonight? I can guide you over the North Ridge. It's dangerous, but it leads to the train station in Silverton. I have money hidden. You can go to San Francisco. You can start over." Sarah looked at the man who had bought her to save her, who healed foxes, and who stood alone against a corrupt town. She thought of the glass house. She thought of the way he had covered her with his cloak. She stepped forward, closing the gap. She placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. It was beating wildly, like a trapped bird. "No," Sarah said firmly. Silas froze. "Sarah, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," she said, her blue eyes blazing. "You think you're protecting me by sending me away, but you're just doing what you always do, isolating yourself so you don't have to lose anyone else." "I can't watch you die," Silas whispered roughly. "Then don't let them win," Sarah said. "Finch thinks you're a savage. He thinks I'm a victim. Let's prove him wrong. We don't run, Silas. We fight. But we don't fight with guns." "How then?" Sarah looked toward the cabin, where Silas's library of books waited. "You said you have the deed. You said you have proof of what he did in the war. You said you have the water rights. The proof. It's just my word against his. The deed is real, but the judge is in Finch's pocket." "Then we don't go to the judge," Sarah said, a plan forming in her mind. A plan reckless and dangerous, but the only one they had. "We go to the governor. He's visiting the mining expo in Silverton next week. Finch will be there, trying to court investors for his factory." Silas stared at her. "That's a 3-day trek through the blizzard." "Then we better start packing," Sarah said, "because I'm not leaving this mountain as a widow, and I'm certainly not leaving it as a victim." For the first time since she had met him, Silas Thorne smiled. It was small, hesitant, and it twisted his scar, but it reached his eyes. "You are a stubborn woman, Sarah Miller." "I'm a survivor, Silas Thorne, and so are you." The journey to Silverton was not merely a trek. It was a war against the elements. The mountain, as if sensing Silas's defiance, threw its full fury against them. The wind screamed through the canyons, whipping snow into blinding white sheets that erased the world 3 feet in front of their faces. They had been walking for 2 days. Silas led the mule, which carried their meager supplies, and the iron box containing the evidence against Finch. He broke the trail, his massive body ploughing through waist-deep drifts, creating a wake for Sarah to follow. He had tied a rope around his waist and secured the other end to her, a lifeline in the blinding whiteout. "Keep moving," Silas roared over the wind, though his voice was barely a whisper against the gale. "If we stop, we freeze." Sarah's legs burned with lactic acid. Her lungs felt like they were filled with crushed glass. But she kept her eyes on Silas's broad back. He was an unstoppable force, a titan of fur and muscle refusing to yield. By nightfall on the 2nd day, the temperature plummeted to a deadly degree. The trees were groaning under the weight of the ice. Silas stopped abruptly near a jagged overhang of slate rock, a shallow cave, barely enough to keep the wind off, but it was their only option. "We camp here," he shouted, pulling the mule into the shelter of the rock. They worked in a frantic, practiced rhythm. Silas gathered deadwood from under the snow, his hands moving with desperate speed. Sarah unpacked the furs. Within minutes, a fire was crackling, its heat a small, defiant circle of life in the frozen void. They huddled together against the rock wall, the fire between them and the storm. Silas looked exhausted. Ice clung to his beard, and his face was pale, the scar standing out in stark crimson relief. He was shivering, something Sarah had never seen before. He had given her his extra cloak hours ago when she had stumbled. "You're freezing," Sarah said, realizing with horror that the mountain man was mortal. "I'm fine," Silas grunted, his teeth chattering, "just tired." "You're a terrible liar, Silas Thorne," Sarah said softly. She moved the fire closer, then did something that would have terrified her a week ago. She unclasped her cloaks and opened them like wings. "Come here." Silas looked at her, his eyes wide. "Sarah, no. It's not proper." "Proper?" Sarah let out a sharp, hysterical laugh. "We are 2 specks of dust on a mountain in a blizzard. Propriety died 10 miles back. Come here, or so help me God, I will drag you." Silas hesitated, then moved. He settled next to her, and she wrapped the heavy furs around them both, cocooning them together. The contact was shocking. He was shaking violently. Sarah wrapped her arms around his torso, pressing her body against his to share her warmth. For a long time they just breathed, the heat slowly returning to Silas's limbs. The smell of him, pine, wood smoke, and honest sweat, filled her senses. It wasn't the smell of a beast, it was the smell of a man who worked the earth. "Why do you carve birds?" Sarah asked into the darkness, her head resting on his chest. She could hear his heart thumping, steady, strong, rhythmic. Silas was quiet for a moment. His shivering had stopped. "Because they can leave," he whispered. "They don't need trails. They don't need permission. They just fly above the mess we make down here." "Is that what you wanted? To leave?" "I wanted to disappear," Silas admitted, his voice vibrating against her ear. "After the war, after the trial, I felt dirty, like the blood wouldn't wash off. I thought if I came up here, the snow would cover me. Make me clean again." Sarah pulled back slightly to look at him. The firelight flickered in his dark eyes. "You are clean, Silas. You're the cleanest man I've ever known. Finch wears silk, but his soul is covered in filth. You wear furs, but your heart is gold." Silas looked at her, really looked at her, with a vulnerability that stripped away the years of hardening. He reached up, his rough hand cupping her cheek. His thumb traced her jawline with a reverence that made Sarah's breath hitch. "Nobody has ever looked at me the way you do," Silas murmured. "Not before the scar. Not after." "Then they were blind," Sarah whispered. Silas leaned in. The kiss wasn't savage or demanding. It was tentative, a question asked in the dark. Sarah answered it, pressing her lips to his, weaving her fingers into his tangled hair. The kiss deepened, becoming an anchor in the storm, a promise that they were alive, that they were together, and that they belonged to each other. When they broke apart, breathless, Silas rested his forehead against hers. "If we make it to Silverton, if we survive this, I don't want you to leave. Not for San Francisco. Not for anywhere." "I'm not going anywhere," Sarah promised, tears pricking her eyes. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Silverton was a sensory assault. After weeks of silence and wind, the cacophony of the mining city was jarring. Steam whistles shrieked, horse hooves clattered on cobblestones, and the air smelled of coal smoke and unrefined ore. Silas and Sarah walked into town leading their weary mule. They looked like apparitions from a folklore tale, wild, ragged, covered in furs and frost. People stopped on the boardwalks to stare. Mothers pulled children closer. The legend of the beast of Blackwood had travelled even here. Silas kept his head down, his shoulders hunched, trying to shrink inside his coat. He hated the eyes. He hated the judgment. Sarah, however, walked with her head high. She gripped Silas's arm tightly, not for support, but to claim him. Let them stare, she thought. They don't know he's a king. They found a boarding house on the edge of town that didn't ask questions, paid for with a pinch of Silas's gold dust. The room was small, but it had a copper tub and hot water. "We have 4 hours until the governor's banquet begins at the Grand Hotel," Sarah said, pacing the room. She was running on nervous energy. "Finch will be there. He's presenting his proposal for the new hydraulic mine at 8 o'clock. Silas sat on the edge of the bed, looking at his hands. "They won't let us in, Sarah. Look at us. Look at me." Sarah stopped pacing. She walked over to him, grabbed his chin, and lifted his face. "We aren't going as the mountain man and the runaway. We are going as Mr. and Mrs. Thorne, landowners of Blackwood Valley." "Mrs. Thorne?" Silas's eyebrows shot up. "It sounds reliable. she said, a blush touching her cheeks. "Now get in that tub. I'm going out to buy supplies." When Sarah returned an hour later, she carried 2 bundles. She found Silas scrubbing weeks of grime from his skin. The water was grey, but he looked cleaner than she had ever seen him. "Sit," she commanded, pulling a straight razor and a pair of shears from her bundle. Silas stiffened. "What are you doing?" "Trust me." For the next hour, Sarah became a sculptor. She trimmed the wild, tangled beard that hid his face. She didn't shave it off completely, that would be too drastic, but she tamed it into a groomed, short beard that framed his jawline rather than obscuring it. She cut his hair, shearing away the matted grey ends to reveal the thick, black waves underneath. When she was finished, she handed him a mirror. Silas stared. The scar was still there, undeniable and white against his skin, but without the chaotic frame of hair, it didn't look like a mark of madness. It looked like a badge of survival. The man in the mirror was handsome, in a rugged, dangerous way. He looked distinguished. "I haven't seen this face in 10 years, he whispered. "It's a good face," Sarah said softly, resting her hands on his bare shoulders. "Now, put this on." She handed him the second bundle, a charcoal grey suit. It was second-hand, bought from a tailor who catered to miners who struck it rich, but it was well made. When Silas stood up in the suit, the transformation was complete. He filled the doorway, his broad shoulders stretching the fabric, his posture straightening. He didn't look like a savage. He looked like a force of nature constrained in silk and wool. Sarah dressed in a deep blue gown she had found. Simple, but the colour brought out the fire in her eyes. She pinned her hair up, exposing her neck. "Ready?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Silas offered his arm. He wasn't shaking anymore. "Ready?" The Grand Hotel was a palace of electric lights and crystal chandeliers. Carriages lined the street, depositing men in top hats and women in diamonds. Security guards stood at the gilded doors, checking invitations. Silas and Sarah approached. Silas's heart was hammering against his ribs, but he kept his face, impassive. "Invitation?" The doorman sneered, looking them up and down. They looked fine, but they didn't have the softness of the city folk. They looked like trouble. "We don't need an invitation," Silas rumbled. His voice was deep, commanding, the voice of a man who shouted down wolves. "I am Silas Thorne. I own the water rights to the land Governor Sterling is discussing tonight. Unless you want the governor to sign a contract that is illegal and void before the ink dries, you will let us in." The doorman hesitated. The confidence in Silas's voice was absolute. "I can't," the doorman stammered. "Is there a problem here?" A sharp voice cut in. A man in a sheriff's uniform stepped forward, but before he could speak, Sarah stepped in. She recognized the sheriff's uncertainty. "Sheriff," she said, her voice dripping with polite, icy authority. "My husband has traveled 3 days through a blizzard to save the governor from a chaotic lawsuit. If you turn us away, and it comes out tomorrow that the governor was humiliated because of your doorman, whose badge do you think will be on the desk?" The sheriff looked at Silas, then at Sarah. He saw the steel in their eyes. He saw the way Silas's hand rested near his coat pocket, not threateningly, but with assurance. "Let them in," the sheriff grunted to the doorman, "but keep an eye on them." The doors swung open. The ballroom was a sea of noise and colour. Hundreds of people milled about, drinking champagne. At the far end, on a raised dais, sat Governor Sterling, a rotund man with a white moustache, and standing next to him, laughing and pointing at a large map, was Barnaby Finch. Finch looked triumphant. He held a champagne glass high, basking in the adoration of the investors. He was moments away from securing the funding, to tear Blackwood Mountain apart. Silas gripped Sarah's hand. His palm was sweating. "There he is." "He doesn't see us," Sarah whispered. "We need to get to the stage." They began to move through the crowd. It was like wading through molasses. People turned to look at the towering man with the scar and the fierce woman beside him. Whispers started to ripple through the room. "Who is that? Is that Thorne? I thought he was dead." Finch, sensing a shift in the room's energy, stopped laughing. He scanned the crowd. His eyes swept over the heads of the bankers and wives, and then they locked onto Silas. Finch's face went slack. The champagne glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the hardwood floor. The sound silenced the room. "Ghost," Finch mouthed, his face draining of color. Silas didn't stop. He walked straight toward the stage, the crowd parting before him like the Red Sea. He wasn't the beast in the shadows anymore. He was the judgment coming for the sinner. "Governor Sterling!" Silas's voice boomed across the silent hall, echoing off the vaulted ceiling. The governor looked up, startled. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" "I am the man whose name is on the deed to the land this liar is trying to sell you," Silas declared, stepping up to the edge of the dais. He pulled a thick, leather-bound ledger and a roll of parchment from his coat. "And I have come to show you exactly how Barnaby Finch made his fortune." Finch snapped out of his shock. "Seize him!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "He's a madman. He's armed. Security! Kill him!" 3 guards rushed toward the stage. Silas turned to face them, not raising his fists, but standing his ground. "I wouldn't do that!" Sarah's voice rang out, clear and sharp. She stepped up beside Silas, facing the crowd. "Because the man you are about to attack is the only reason half the men in this room are alive." She pointed a trembling finger at a group of older investors near the front, men with military pins on their lapels. "Colonel Hayes," Sarah said, recognizing a face from one of Silas's old war photographs she had found in the cabin. "You commanded the 4th Battalion at Shiloh, didn't you?" The old man blinked, stepping forward. "I did." "This is Sergeant Silas Thorne," Sarah said, placing a hand on Silas's chest. "The man who held the ridge while your supply lines were cut. The man who was court-martialed for exposing the quartermaster who was stealing your ammunition." She turned her gaze to Finch. "The quartermaster named Barnaby Finch." A gasp went through the room. Colonel Hayes stared at Silas, squinting through the scars and the years. Recognition dawned in his eyes, slow and horrifying. "Thorne," Hayes whispered. "My God, we thought you died in prison." "He didn't die," Sarah said, her voice rising with righteous fury. "He survived, and he kept the receipts." She took the ledger from Silas and slammed it onto the governor's table. "Read it," she challenged. Finch lunged. Panic had overridden his senses. He pulled a Derringer pistol from his vest pocket, aiming it at Silas's back. "No!" he shrieked. But Silas was faster. He had spent 10 years reacting to the snap of twigs and the shift of wind. He spun around, his hand lashing out with the speed of a striking viper. He caught Finch's wrist in mid-air. Crunch! Finch screamed as the pistol dropped to the floor. Silas twisted the arm, forcing the mayor to his knees in front of the governor, in front of the investors, in front of the whole world. Silas leaned down, his face inches from Finch's. The scar on his cheek pulsed. "I told you," Silas whispered, his voice a low growl that only Finch could hear. "The next thing I brought to town would be your head. But I think I'll settle for your ruin." The silence in the Grand Hotel ballroom was suffocating. All eyes were glued to Governor Sterling as he adjusted his spectacles, his hand trembling slightly. As he turned the pages of the leather-bound ledger, Sarah had slammed onto the table. Barnaby Finch remained on his knees, his arm twisted behind his back by Silas's iron grip. The mayor was panting, sweat beading on his forehead. The spell of his wealth had been broken by the ghost he thought he had buried. October 14th, 1862. The governor read aloud, his voice projecting clearly. Shipment of 2,000 wool blankets intended for the 4th Battalion, marked as lost in transit. Sold to Confederate privateers in Memphis. A murmur of shock rippled through the crowd. Colonel Hayes, a veteran standing in the front row, went pale. "My men froze to death that winter," he whispered, his voice shaking. "We lost 40 boys. You told us the train was derailed, Finch." "It's a forgery," Finch sputtered, wincing as Silas tightened his grip. "That savage wrote it." "There are bank drafts attached," the governor interrupted, his tone icy. "Signed by you. And here, November 3rd, 500 crates of ammunition sold, replaced with crates of sand and sawdust." The room erupted. It wasn't just a murmur anymore. It was a roar of outrage. The polished veneer of society crumbled, replaced by the raw anger of betrayal. "Sheriff!" the governor barked. "Arrest this man for treason and war profiteering. Seize his assets immediately." As the sheriff marched onto the stage with iron cuffs, Silas released Finch, shoving him toward the lawman. Finch scrambled, spitting venom. "You think you've won, Thorne? You're still a monster. You'll never be anything but a scarred beast." Silas stood tall, his hand finding Sarah's. He looked at the screaming man with profound, quiet pity. "The war is over, Barnaby," Silas said softly. "You're the only one still fighting it." As Finch was dragged away, Colonel Hayes walked up to the stage. He looked at the scar, then at the man behind it. Slowly, the colonel raised his hand and offered a sharp, respectful salute. One by one, the other veterans in the room did the same. Silas, his throat tight, returned the salute. He was no longer a ghost. Later that night, in the quiet of their hotel room, the adrenaline faded. Sarah sat by the window, watching the snow fall on Silverton. "It's over," she whispered. "He can't hurt anyone ever again." Silas sat on the edge of the bed, looking at Sarah with a lingering question. "Sarah, there is something I never told you about why I walked into the store that day." He pulled a worn, tintype photograph from his coat. It showed a group of soldiers laughing. In the center was a young Silas, and next to him, with an arm draped over his shoulder, was a man Sarah recognized instantly. "My father," she gasped. "Private John Miller," Silas said reverently. "He was the best man in the unit. The night I went to investigate Finch's logs, John covered for me. He died so I could bring that ledger home. I've carried that guilt for 10 years. He knelt before her. I saw his eyes in you the moment you looked at me in that store. I couldn't save him, Sarah. But when I saw Finch trying to destroy his daughter, I knew I had to save you. It was the only way I could pay the debt I owed his ghost." Sarah grabbed Silas's face, tears spilling from her eyes. "You don't owe him anything. You honored him. You aren't a monster, Silas. You're the best man my father ever knew, and the best man I will ever know." 3 days later, they returned to Blackwood Valley. The blizzard had broken, replaced by the bright sun of early spring. The town was free. Finch was gone, and his predatory loans were annulled. As Silas and Sarah rode through, the townsfolk didn't cheer. They looked ashamed. The baker's wife stepped forward, offering a basket of fresh bread. "Mr. Thorne." "We didn't know." Silas took the bread, nodding simply. He didn't stay. He turned the mule toward the mountain. "Are you sure?" Sarah asked. "We could live down here." Silas looked up at the cabin, nestled against the rock face. "This is a real house," he said, holding her hand, "because you are here." Spring hit the mountain with a riot of color. In the glass house, the roses were in full bloom. Sarah sat on the porch, her belly round with the promise of a child due before autumn. She watched Silas near the woodpile. He wasn't chopping wood, he was carving. He brought her the finished piece, an eagle with its wings spread wide, protecting a smaller dove tucked beneath it. "Finished?" Sarah asked. "Finished," Silas smiled, resting his hand on her stomach. The baby kicked, and Silas laughed, a sound that echoed off the canyon walls. The town below still whispered stories about the mountain man. But now they told of a guardian in the clouds, a man who walked through hell to save them. They said, if you looked up at the high peaks, you wouldn't see a monster. You would see a home filled with light, where the beast had been tamed not by force, but by love. What a journey. From the frozen isolation of the mountains to the heated courtroom, Silas and Sarah's story proves that true strength isn't about violence, but sacrifice. Silas was judged by his scars, but it was his gentle heart that saved the town and healed a broken family. It reminds us that sometimes the monsters society fears are just heroes waiting for someone to see their worth. If you loved this story of redemption and justice, please hit that like button. What do you think about the twist with Sarah's father? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another Wild West story.